Okay, two Democrat slave plantations, the big bait and switch. Hello, I'm Jim McCotter. Welcome, everyone. In the 60s, the Democrats successfully pulled off the biggest political bait and switch in American history. Up to the Civil War, most African Americans were slaves on Southern Democrat plantations. After the Civil War, the slaves had the, quote, right, end quote, to vote. But it was well documented that the Southern Democrats used many means, including fear and intimidation, to keep blacks from voting until Democrat President Lyndon Baines Johnson came into office. In the 60s, as media began exposing the horrors of the Democrats' intimidation tactics, President Lyndon Baines Johnson and political Democrat strategists began a different tactic to control minority votes: the big bait and switch, switching from intimidation to entitlement. The bait was entitlement, encompassed in the LBJ's new Great Society welfare state. Johnson bullied this through with everyone. In Ronald Kessler's book, Inside the White House, 1996, Lyndon Johnson, while on Air Force One, explained to two of his Democrat governors the big switch strategy from intimidation to entitlement, and in his private, vulgar way, he told them, "I have those N blankety blank voting Democratic for the next 200 years," end quote. But Malcolm X also exposed this same liberal Democrat tactic in his 1963 address. Quote, "The white liberal differs from the white conservative only in one way: the liberal is more deceitful, more hypocritical than the conservative. Both want power, but the white liberal is the one who has perfected the art of posing as the Negro's friend and benefactor. And by winning the friendship and support of the Negro, the white liberal is able to use the Negro as a pawn or a weapon in this political football game that is constantly raging between the white liberal and the white conservative." He goes on to say, "The American Negro is nothing but a political football, and the white liberals control this ball through tricks or tokenisms, false promises of integration and civil rights." He continued in saying, "In this game of deceiving and using the American Negro, the white liberals have complete cooperation of the Negro civil rights leaders who sell our people out for a few crumbs of token recognition, token gains, token progress," end quote. Manning Johnson, a black activist recruited by Marxists, but later left them to write Color, Communism, and Common Sense, wrote about this same very thing in 1957. He said, and I quote, "White leftists descended on Negro communities like locusts, posing as friends, coming to help liberate their black brothers. Everything was interracial, and interracialism artificially created, cleverly devised as a camouflage of the red plot to use the Negro." Lyndon Johnson's, end quote. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society welfare state proceeded to enroll large numbers of minorities into the entitlement programs. At first, this was difficult, as most blacks at that time were proud, being independent and self-reliant, and thought it demeaning to be slaves as government dependents. George W. Carver, one of the most prominent black scientists of the early 20th century, wrote in his brief sketch of my life in 1922, quote, "I would never allow anyone to give me money. No difference how badly I needed it. I wanted literally to earn my living," end quote. Despite the humiliation, needy blacks succumbed to the continual enticement of the Democrats' socialist giveaway programs. Before the Civil War, Alexis de Tocqueville, French sociologist, traveled across the United States, and he warned, and I quote, "The American Republic will endure until politicians realize they can bribe the people with their own money," end quote. George Bernard Shaw, political critic, in the early 20th century, he stated, and I quote, "Progress is impossible without change, And those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. And a government policy to rob Peter to pay Paul can be assured of the support of Paul. End quote. This bribe for vote tactic was used by dictator Juan Perón in 1946 to seize political power in Argentina. And in 1999, communist Hugo Chavez used it to seize political power in Venezuela. This has always been the communist socialist left's strategy for seizing power. But as England's Iron Lady Margaret Thatcher warned, and I quote, "The problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money," end quote. Promotion of dependency for political purposes also led to a change in the immigration policy. In the 60s, Lyndon Johnson also changed immigration quotas to bring in more immigrants from poor third world countries. These would be immediately enrolled in entitlement programs and become Democrat voters to get all that free stuff that Democrats would give them. LBJ's immigration policy change initiated a demographic transformation eerily similar to what contributed to the fall of Rome. Will and Ariel Durant wrote in The Story of Civilization in 1944, and I quote, "If Rome had not engulfed so many men of alien blood in so brief a time, if she had occasionally closed the gates to let assimilation catch up with infiltration, she might have gained new racial and literary vitality from the infusion and might have remained a Roman Rome, the voice and citadel west," end quote. NAFTA created dozens more globalist Mexican billionaires, but robbed poor Mexican families of their means of a livelihood, further spurring an immigration north to cross the U.S. borders. These policies contributed to California transitioning from a Republican state to a Democrat state. The Center for Immigration Studies, it reported in December 19, 2019, quote, "The presence of all immigrants will redistribute 26 seats in the House in 2020. Of the 26 seats that will be lost, 24 are from states that voted for Donald Trump in 2016. Of states that will gain House seats because of immigration, 19 seats will go to the solidly Democrat states of California, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Illinois. And immigration profoundly redistributes political power at the federal level by changing the apportionment of House seats and votes in the Electoral College." Robert Rector and Rachel Shenfield, writing in the Background on Poverty and Inequity, that prior to LBJ's War on Poverty, less than 2% of the federal budget was on welfare spending. But 50 years later, spending on anti-poverty programs mushroomed to 27% of the federal budget, costing $22 trillion adjusted by inflation, 3 times the cost of all U.S. military wars since the Revolution, yet with no percentage improvement of the poor. Before LBJ's War on Poverty, less than 5% of children were born to unmarried parents. 50 years later, it was 40%. Before LBJ's War on Poverty, less than 10% U.S. children lived in single-parent houses. 50 years later, it was 33% and 37% by single female parent houses. In 1965, Democrat Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan reported that 25% of all black children were born illegitimately. And in 2015, that jumped to 72%. Today, it's over 75%. African-American economist Walter E. Williams, distinguished professor of economics at George Mason University, he wrote in The Welfare State's Legacy, and I quote, "In 1960, just 22% of black children were raised in single-parent families. 50 years later, more than 70% of black children were raised in single-parent families. Here is my question. Was the increase in single-parent black families after 1960 a legacy of slavery Or might it be a legacy of the welfare state ushered in by the war on poverty? End quote. Tim Gilligan, Deputy Director of the White House Office of Public Liaison from 2001 to 2008, wrote in Focus on the Family Citizen magazine, he stated, "This is perhaps the most dismal legacy of the Johnson years and a sad testament to the vision of social planners who believed more government would mean stronger families and marriages." End quote. Football legend, African-American Republican Representative J.C. Watts Jr., he stated in February 5, 1997, and I quote, "For the past 30 years, our nation spent $5 trillion trying to erase poverty, and the result, as you know, is that we didn't get rid of it at all. In fact, we spread it. We destroyed self-esteem of millions of people, grinding them down in a welfare system that penalizes moms for wanting to marry the father of their children and penalizes moms for wanting to save money. Friends, that's not right." End quote. During Southern Democrat legislation that was controlled by the Democrats in North Carolina, they put together 1831, the Act to Prevent Teaching Slaves to Read. And this is what they legislated, I quote, "Any free person who shall hereafter teach any slave within the state to read or write, or shall give or sell to such slave any books or pamphlets, shall be fined not less than $100, imprisoned, or whipped." End quote. That was the epitome of racism then. But today, we have a different kind of racism that the Democrats have redefined, which is anyone opposing big government dependency welfare programs. In politics, this is called seizing the moral high ground, where those pushing a cause want to appear before the public as more altruistic and caring, while portraying those opposing them as selfish and less caring. A classic example of this is when casinos want to move into an area. Opponents may cite increase in crime, drugs, prostitution, bankruptcy, broken homes, child trafficking. But if the casino donates any money from some of their big profits to schools, they can seize the moral high ground, claiming to care more about children and portraying their opponents as hating children. Another political manipulation tactic is called psychological projection or blame shifting, where the guilty blame the innocent of what they're guilty themselves. Sigmund Freud wrote about this in Case Histories. About the psychological projection is when a person or a group may state to feel concerned. Once they feel concerned or exposed as guilty, they will defend their innocence in excessively accusing others of their own ill behavior, such as racists accusing others of being racist. This is as old as what was written in the Bible back in Genesis 39, where Potiphar's wife accused Joseph of lusting after her when she was the one lusting after Joseph. Democrat political strategist David Axelrod, he said, and I quote, "In Chicago, there was an old tradition of throwing a brick through your own campaign office window and then calling a press conference to say that you've been attacked." End quote. Today, a growing groundswell of many black leaders are getting louder and louder in declaring dependency on government entitlements is reminiscent of the Southern Democrat Plantations. Here are a few of such leaders. Star Parker, founder of Center for Urban Renewal, wrote, "Uncle Sam's Plantation, How Big Government Enslaves America's Poor and What We Can Do About It." Reverend C.L. Bryant produced a documentary movie called Runaway Slave. In it he stated, "I am a runaway slave from the Democrats' plantation." C. Mason Weaver wrote, "It's okay to leave the plantation, the new Underground Railroad." Wayne Perryman wrote, "Unfounded Loyalty, an in-depth look into the love affair between blacks and Democrats." Reverend Bill Owens is the founder of the Coalition of African American Pastors. His wife, Deborah Owens, leads in education for all. Bishop E.W. Jackson is the founder of Stand and the American Radio Show. Thomas Sowell, world-renowned economist, wrote that amazing book, Social Justice Fallacies. Larry Perry, presidential candidate, radio show host, he wrote Stupid Black Men. Jesse Lee Peterson, president of Brotherhood Organization of a New Destiny, acknowledged black unemployment being at the lowest level on record with Donald Trump and helping African Americans leave the Democrat plantation. Video Sports reported in June 2019, and I quote, a former NFL player testifying before Congress on Wednesday spoke out against the concept of reparations. Burgess Owens, formerly of the Jets and Raiders, spoke during hearing for H.R. 40. He said, I used to be a Democrat until I did my history and found the misery that party brought to my race. Let's pay restitution? How about the Democrat Party pay for all the misery they brought to my race? End quote. In the Bible, God exposed wicked Amalek using race politics to overthrow the ancient Hebrew Republic in Judges 9. God called what Amalek did as wickedness. Those who do it today are no less wicked. The famous Chicago communist activist mentor of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton was Saul Alinsky, and in his book, Rules for Radicals, which he dedicated to Lucifer, he wrote this, quote, the organizer's first job is to create the issues or problems. The organizer must first rub these resentments of the people of the community and polarize the issue, lead his forces into conflict. An organizer must stir up dissatisfaction and stir up discontent, fan the latest hostilities, search out controversy. Unless there is controversy, people are not concerned enough to act, end quote. The famous black Republican Booker T. Washington, in the beginning of the 20th century, he wrote, in my larger education, and I quote, there is another class of colored people who make a business of keeping the troubles, the wrongs, the hardships of the Negro race before the public. Having learned that they are able to make a living out of their troubles, they have grown into a settled habit of advertising their wrongs, partly because they want sympathy and partly because it pays. Some of these people do not want the Negro to lose his grievances because they do not want to lose their jobs. He went on to say, there's a certain class of race problem solvers who do not want the patient to get well because as long as the disease holds out, they have not only an easy means of making a living, but also an easy medium through which to make themselves prominent before the public. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stated in November 1, 1940, quote, whoever seeks to set one race against another seeks to enslave all races, end quote. Franklin Roosevelt later wrote in 1944, and I quote, may this country marshal its righteous wrath against those who would divide it by racial struggles, end quote. Finally, Black Honorable Representative J.C. Watts Jr. stated in February 5, 1997, and I quote, too often when we talk about racial healing, we make the old assumption that government can heal the racial divide. It does not happen by dividing us into racial groups. It does not happen by trying to turn rich against poor or by using the politics of fear. It does not happen by reducing our values to the lowest common denominator. And friends, it does not happen by asking Americans to accept what's immoral and wrong in the name of tolerance. We must ask God to heal us from within. And we must be a people of prayer, a people who pray as if the strength of our nation depended on it, because it does.